Good morning and welcome back to our next event as part of Net Zero Week. My name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction journalist and a contributor to Climate Perspectives. And I have with me this morning Sam Hall, who is director of the Conservative Environment Network, CEN, which is the independent forum for conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration, and resource security. A little bit about Sam, who, by the way, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us at this session. Sam joined CEN after serving as a policy advisor to Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And he was also head of research at the Liberal Conservative think tank Bright Blue, leading their work on energy and the environment and authoring several policy reports. For those of you in the audience who were, on a different planet over the last month or so, you might not have noticed, but I'm sure you did, that there was a general election. And I'm going to start with that general election, which Sam's party didn't win. Let's just put it no stronger than that at this point. But I think it's right that I begin with the election. Responding to your party's general election manifesto, Sam, you said that this is when the manifesto was launched. You said, and I quote, to get political credit for their past achievements and win voters' trust over their future plans, the party needs to be more vocal in championing this positive conservative case for why protecting the environment is important for our security and prosperity. Looking at the results of the election, why do you think that didn't get across to people last week?
Well, firstly, Andy, thank you very much for the invitation to join this session and to be part of the Net Zero Week discussions. It's great to be with you, particularly, as you say, at a very timely moment coming just a few days after the general election results. So as you say, that comment was in response to the Conservative Party manifesto, which I actually thought had some good climate and nature policies within it. It basically pledged to maintain lots of the existing commitments, things like the zero emission vehicle mandate. It actually even had some good statements about some of the records of the Conservative governments in recent years. But what was frustrating for me is that it didn't match up with the rhetoric we heard from Rishi Sunak and some of the other leading ministers throughout the campaign, where instead there was a much greater focus on the costs of clean technologies and how Labour's 2030 clean power target was going to be much more expensive for consumers. And I think what's very frustrating about that is that ultimately I think what the party has done on climate and nature in the last 14 years, obviously they didn't get everything right. Obviously there's much more to do, but there is absolutely a lot of achievements there to be proud of, from building the 5 biggest offshore wind farms in the world to nearly phasing out coal-fired power stations. And you just didn't hear that record come across. I think the reason for it, the reason why the party went with that messaging, I think was partly in response to the Uxbridge by-election, which happened last summer, where the Conservatives fought on a campaign to stop the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone. As the Labour were in favour of it through Sadiq Khan. And that was the surprise by-election result. It was one of the few election contests that Conservatives won in the past year or so. And I think they kind of hung on to it as a sign of how they could potentially claw back some more votes as a general election. So they looked to replicate it. They did the net zero roadback speech in September, where Rishi Sunak delayed a few net zero targets. But I think what we can now see is that strategy didn't succeed. In fact, when Uxbridge was contested again at the general election, it did indeed fall to Labour. And I think the party was obviously hoping that you could contrast a kind of cost of living concern about clean technologies with an environmental policy, and voters would choose to kind of save themselves money. And I think it's undoubtedly the case that people are very cost sensitive to clean technologies, but they just don't blame green policies for the high cost of living. They blame global factors such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine and so on. And so fundamentally, it didn't work as a sort of wedge strategy, and it didn't win back those reform voters, and obviously cost the Conservatives Conservatives dozens of seats across the UK. It wasn't the thing that they were most passionate about. I think immigration was the main factor driving their votes rather than opposition to net zero policies. So, as a strategy, it failed, and I hope the party can kind of learn from this and learn that actually a positive plan to tackle climate change to restore nature is an electoral asset for the party, and hopefully that will be part of the conversations as they now start to figure out how to rebuild and get back into a position where they can win power again.
Interesting you mentioned the rise of reform, of which there's been many words expanded by the commentariat since last Thursday's results. Clearly the use of net zero as a wedge issue is one that's been employed, I think to a certain extent, maybe by your own party and certainly by Reform. Labour's going to have this problem as well, from the point of view that in many seats around the country, Reform came second to Labour. And so Labour is going to have to look at what maybe they're saying potentially around issues like the environment. And, I know it's kind of not your role, but what would your advice to be to them if you were advising them? Obviously, you'd be charging them top dollar, I'm sure. But what would your advice to them be in terms of actually taking on those kind of more negative views around net zero and the environment, where they're facing that kind of threat from reform?
I think the first starting point would be to look at what Reform voters actually think about the environment. That generally Reform voters are much more sceptical of net zero by 2050 as a goal than voters for other political parties, and lots of surveys back that up. But actually, when you start to ask Reform voters whether they're concerned about climate change, whether they support investment in renewable energy, and actually this idea that Reform voters are totally opposed to anything green sort of falls apart. Like, you can get majorities of Reform voters in support of some of those statements. So, I think first thing to say is I wouldn't write them off as people who are just always going to be opposed to net zero. I think if you talk about it in the right way, talk about it in terms of energy security in particular, about homegrown energy, green industries as a way to bring investment and opportunities to some of our industrial heartlands, I think you can win some of them over with that type of rhetoric. But I also think you have to look at what really is driving the Reform votes, and it's not either support or opposition to green policies. I think a lot of it was like lots of the country, they felt the Conservatives had just been incompetent, they hadn't done a good enough job on things like the economy. But the top issue that comes out in all the surveys that are done on Reform voters' attitudes is immigration. So I think my advice to Labour would actually be, if you want to stave off the threat from Reform, you probably need to look at other areas that Reform voters do really care about, such as getting a grip on immigration numbers and the small boats issue. So I think that's probably the best way to try and tackle them. And then, at the same time, in terms of your net zero policies, trying to avoid making them too polarizing. I think net zero advocates always have to be careful to make sure that we are, ensuring our policies are not overly burdening people with expensive costs, particularly people on lower incomes. I think net zero policies have to be fair, they have to be affordable, and I think it is totally possible to design policies that are those things. But yeah, I think as Ed Miliband settles in the new department, he needs to make sure that that is a kind of test that he's applying to all of his net zero policies, so it doesn't fuel that anti-net zero sentiment.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the successes that you don't think you got across well enough during the course of the campaign. So, talk about some of those successes over the last 14 years. Has the government, or what was your government, been successful in reducing emissions and championing net zero in your view?
I think it undoubtedly has. If you look at the kind of decarbonisation rates of G20 economies over the period of the last Conservative government, and the UK's been at the top of the league table. We've got some big signature achievements around the development of the offshore wind sector in particular. The UK is second only to China in terms of total offshore wind installed capacity. The country that first started burning coal for electricity in the Industrial Revolution has been the first to phase it out in terms of major economies. So I think the UK has got a really good record. Much of that was delivered under Conservative governments. And I think there's also some positive foundations that have been laid in other sectors. We all know that the power sector's we know well on its way now to reaching net zero. But the policies such as the benefit in kind company car tax reductions for electric vehicles has led to a massive increase in fleets buying electric cars. That's supplying the second-hand market for low-income motorists to buy electric cars. So we'll sort of start to see the impact of that alongside the zero-emission vehicle mandate as well. In the heating sector, the Conservative government increased the grant scheme, and we've now seen a big response from consumers to that increased grant through the boiler upgrade scheme. More people are buying heat pumps, and hopefully that will then feed through into lower heat pump prices as the market scales, and there's lots of volume in the markets. And then in farming and agriculture, again, the environmental land management schemes, the new systems for rewarding and incentivizing farmers to adopt more climate-friendly and nature-friendly practices, those are just starting to be rolled out, and thousands of farmers are in those new schemes across England. And you can point to similar promising starts of policies such as the CCS clusters, the sustainable aviation fuel mandates, and so on. So I think there are some really good foundations, not very well communicated, and a lot of the not seeing the fruits of some of these policies yet in terms of these sectors actually maturing. But yeah, I think overall it's a good legacy. That is not to say that every decision was right, and I think onshore winds in England, there shouldn't have been that block on the planning, and that was something that as Sten we kind of campaigned against. And yeah, there is obviously lots more to do. We've got gaps in terms of net zero delivery on heating, on industry still. More firm policy needs to be put in place. So don't want to be complacent about the record. Clearly, there's a lot more to do. But yeah, I think there were some good achievements, and there should have been more pride expressed in those achievements by Conservatives, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you talk about the communication aspect of that, because that's come up increasingly in many of the conversations that we're having and will have during the course of the next few days in net zero week. I actually think it from working in a comms area, I actually think this is critical and crucial to basically winning public acceptance and understanding for what needs to be done. I'm obviously aware of the political issues in play, and you've mentioned some of them yourself. But for me, communication really is important. Why do you think that maybe that message didn't get across in the way that it should have done? And also, it'll be interesting to see what the new government does in that area, because it will still need to communicate the benefits of what it's proposing and also what it's doing in this area. So how can we communicate this better to the general public in order ultimately to influence behaviour change?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think it is definitely one of the main challenges that we have. In terms of why I don't think the government communicated it, I think there was this sort of phenomenon of green hushing. I think within the government there was an anxiety that talking too loudly and proudly about what the government had done on climate would alienate some of the kind of more net zero skeptic parts of the voter coalition. But I think what we ended up with was in effect the worst of both worlds. The rhetoric, which was quite negative about net zero, put off a lot of the pro-environment voters that I think the party does need to appeal to in places like the southeast and the southwest of England. But because the underlying policies themselves haven't really changed, the negative messaging was not enough to win back some of the more sceptical reform voters. So, I think as a strategy, having that link up between actually what your policies are and the rhetoric is so important. And if you are going to commit to net zero, and if you are going to have net zero policies to try and hit the target, then you need to get out on the front foot and make the case for them. And you need to sort of explain why your policies are affordable, fair, and economically in the national interest. I think just quickly on kind of narratives, I think I'm obviously less well placed to talk about how Labour can communicate, but I think in terms of how you might communicate to a Conservative audience, and let's not forget that in the last general election, something like 40% of the electorate voted for either the Conservative Party or the Reform Party, sort of parties of the right of centre. It's a big chunk of the electorate that all net zero advocates really do still need to try to speak to. It's no good just speaking to Labour voters, because that's not a majority of the public, and we need to keep the right on side as we transition to net zero, as well as the left of politics. But I think we need to talk about some of the issues that do animate and exercise the right. So security. I think making the argument that because fossil fuels from the North Sea are in terminal decline, and we can't rely on those forever. We've got to produce more homegrown energy, and the only source of that available is renewables. Making that security argument, I think, is really crucial. I think making the economic argument as well. Talking about how we need to get growth back to our economy, how we need cheap energy as an input, to mean businesses have got cheap energy to be able to make goods affordably and competitively with other countries. The cheapest sources of new energy are solar and wind. So I think that's a key argument, alongside the growth story from new green industries. The green economy has been growing at a much faster rate than the whole economy overall, and so investing more in those green industries, backing them, I think is a way to raise our trend growth rate. So I think emphasising some of these narratives, I think, is going to be really crucial to keep the centre right on side as we transition to net zero.
So you talked about security and economy there, Sam. How essentially then do you think a conservative approach to net zero should differ from other approaches? What's kind of the thing that you would look at and think, yeah, I get that. That's what they're saying in that area, as opposed to what Labour are doing, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that what the kind of Conservative Party's approach to net zero is still quite unknown. There's going to be a leadership contest for Rishi Sunak's replacement. The new party leader will want to figure out the direction of travel they want to take net zero policy within the party. So we suppose we don't necessarily know about that. In terms of what I think the kind of small
Just on
C
that, what do
Conservative.
you? Sorry to interrupt, Sam. Just on
Yeah,
that, because
sure.
I think I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
clearly, the new leadership will have its own view. What do you think is the future of net zero in the Conservative Party policy platform going forward,
Well, I
or is
think
it too early to say?
it obviously is too early to say definitively, but I think there are some good signs for optimism. We at SEN have worked with a parliamentary caucus of Conservative MPs and peers in the House of Parliament, and in terms of the MPs who got returned at the election from the Conservative side, something like a half of them have either members of the SEN caucus who have been in the SEN caucus in the past and gone on to ministerial roles, and so had to leave the caucus. So I think we're starting from a kind of good base in the parliamentary party. I think there are supporters of the environmental agenda within the Conservative parliamentary party, and ultimately they're the ones that shortlist the final two candidates that go to the membership vote for the next party leader. I also think, I mean, the other kind of key argument for us will be the sort of political argument around where the voters are. And I think listening to some of the debate within the Conservative Party in recent days about why they lost, yes, there is deep concern about reform and the fact reform voters, a lot of Conservatives went over to reform at the last election. But even if you added all the reform voters to the Conservative total in all the constituencies, it still wouldn't have got the Conservative Party majority. So to win again the Conservative Party, and I think this is now kind of getting broadly accepted, yes, it needs to win back some of those reform voters. It needs to hang on to its existing voters, and it also needs to go and win back some of the centre ground voters it lost to the Lib Dems and Labour. And I think in that context, a strong environmental policy platform is going to be a net asset to the party politically. It will help them win back some of those centre ground voters. It is supported by mainstream traditional Conservative voters who stuck with the party last time, and as discussed previously, it's not necessarily going to be hugely popular with reform voters, but it's also not the thing that they care about most. So provided it's balanced with some other policies that will appeal to those right-wing voters, I think the environment can be a unifying issue and help the party rebuild. And I think that is, an argument obviously we're going to be making a lot at SEN in the coming months as the party chooses its next leader.
So on that basis, then, are you concerned that a potential drift to the right as the party looks to address what might be seen as a threat from reform, might mean that the issues of sustainability and net zero lose out to other policies? Or do you think, as you've just said, that actually if you get the framing of that right and concentrated on the areas of kind of commonality, then obviously you can still win with a focus on the environment?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've always tried to argue at Sen is that the environment doesn't belong to any particular faction within the Conservative Party. It's something that I think has supporters, from the kind of One Nation, more moderate wing of the party through to the more right wing, more Eurosceptic faction of the party. And I think one of our kind of lodestars, one of the kind of figureheads that we like to quote a lot at Sen is Margaret Thatcher, who was the first world leader warned about climate change at the UN in the 1980s,
She
and
was
obviously is
indeed.
very
It's often forgotten, but
seen
she
as a
actually was.
exactly. And people from the right of the party obviously very much put Margaret Thatcher on a pedestal, and I think for that reason, we try and not sort of push back against this idea that the environment is a kind of centre of the Conservative Party issue, and sort of doesn't appeal to the right. But I think even taking on its own terms, obviously the people on the right of the party have different priorities. I think some of them, very much want to see a smaller state. They want to sort of cut taxes, cut the state back in terms of size and what it does. And I think the argument to those people is, well, yes, getting to net zero is going to require a small bit of intervention in the short term. But if we don't tackle net zero, if we don't take climate action early, the costs to the state will be much bigger overall. And the Office for Budget Responsibility has calculated this. The intervention that would be required to rapidly mitigate climate change and adapt to it once it had kind of run out of control would be much greater. So, it's there's that argument that you play back to the small state Conservatives, and then on those who are more worried about immigration, I think you say to them, sort of talk about the phenomenon of climate migration, that as water and food insecurity grows due to climate change and extreme weather events overseas, that can cause displacement of people, can be a pressure on migration. So, I think we've got to try and make arguments in the language of the kind of right of the party, and try and make this be seen as an issue that appeals to them and can speak to and deliver on their priorities.
Looking forward, we're obviously going to be expecting a slew of announcements from the new government in this particular area. I know that Ed Miliband, I interviewed him about 2 months ago. He was itching to implement all of his policies, or their policies, in relation to this area. Are there areas where the Conservatives could provide a constructive opposition to the new Labour government's net zero policies, and how would you go about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really crucial role for the Conservatives to play in opposition. I think obviously part of it, I think, will be trying to develop a critique of what Labour's doing that is sort of pro-environment, and so we're not just criticising, it going too fast, or the ambition being too high, but actually highlighting where Labour's not delivering against the ambition that it set itself. And I think the other aspect will be putting forward a Conservative alternative, so not just opposing, but having a plan to do something differently, more in tune with Conservative principles. So to give us a few examples of where I think those areas might lie, I think firstly is this sort of version of the transition that is more market-led as opposed to more state-led. I think if you look at what Ed Miliband is looking to do through the setting up of GB Energy, a kind of state-owned company, I think Labour want to see the state take a much bigger role in the transition, and I think as Conservatives, going back to your earlier question of what is a distinctive Conservative approach to it, I think fairly top of the list would be, an approach that sets the frameworks, that creates the incentives, that gets government out of the way in terms of planning and regulation, and lets market deliver things at pace. And I think ultimately that will be cheaper in the first instance. So you'll be able to bring market forces, competition to play to drive down costs, but also you can get private finance delivering a lot of it. So you don't have to rely as much on state funding and state borrowing, which I think will help in the current fiscal climate. A couple of other areas, I think, on sort of planning and net zero infrastructure, this is an area where I've got a lot of sympathy personally with what Labour is looking to do, like normalising the onshore wind treatment in the planning system and getting rid of the de facto ban. That's something that we've sort of pushed forward, Sen, as well. But I think it's important that in doing that, they don't totally jettison the idea of bringing communities with us. I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to face with the net zero transition is local community opposition to new infrastructure. And I think, yes, normalise the planning system for onshore wind, but make sure that we use community benefits. We have good ways of engaging communities about the design of schemes to make sure that we're not alienating communities and storing up a backlash. And then the final area I'd pick out is around sustainable farming. This was an area that Labour said that they're going to continue with the reforms to farm subsidies, paying farmers to sequester carbon, plant trees, expand their hedgerows, look after their soils better, and so on, rather than just payments for farm area under management, as we had under the EU. But they've not committed to the budget. They've not committed to protecting it in cash terms or real terms, as was the case in the Conservative manifesto. So I think that's an area where the Conservatives, I think, can really challenge Labour as the party that designed the schemes. Still has a lot of rural seats. I think, yes, we need to reform the payment, but we also need to make sure that there's enough budget there to support farmers' incomes, as well as make sure we're getting the environmental outcomes that we need.
So obviously, there's a bit of a changed political landscape for your party, to put it mildly. How do you think you and your colleagues in the Conservative Environment Network are going to argue for these policies going forward, recognising that there has been that change?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big change politically. I think there are a few different things that we've got planned in the coming months. We'll be trying to reach out to the new set of MPs that have been elected. I think so much of what we do at Sen is trying to show that there's parliamentary support for net zero, and so we'll be contacting MPs, encouraging them to sign up. The leadership contest, which we've talked about a bit already, but that's obviously going to be really crucial for setting the policy agenda for this parliament for the Conservative Party, and so trying to get some strong commitments from the candidates, I think, will be crucial. But I think maybe above all, I think the argument we'll need to win, and the argument we'll be making throughout the parliament, is a political one. Opposition's, because you're not governing, you're on permanent campaign mode. You're very focused on trying to get back into power. So I think we'll need to show why environmental policies are a net political asset to the Conservative Party. So whether that's in the red wall seats, where obviously the Conservatives lost nearly all their seats that they won in 2019, talking about the green industrial opportunities, pointing to places like Teesside, which have seen huge investment come in off the back of our net zero targets and the build out of renewable energy and other industries that have been required to hit them. That, I think, is a really key narrative to land. In the blue wall, the sort of heartlands of the Conservative Party around London in the home counties, we saw issues like sewage, loss of green space being really salient there in those communities. So again, trying to develop that and show the importance of environmental issues to winning back some of those constituencies from the Liberal Democrats. And then finally, I think there's also this interesting phenomenon that we're seeing now about the Green Party doing well in Conservative areas. They've won, for example, in the Waveney Valley and in North Hertfordshire. And I think those sorts of communities, very much traditionally been Conservative, but clearly voters there care about wildlife, they care about their landscapes, and I think that's something that the party needs to tap into as well. So we'll be trying to make that strong political case that to get back into power, the Conservatives need to rediscover their positive Conservative environmentalist agenda, which I think have had at various points throughout the last 14 years in government. But I think it can be an asset again if the party gets back to some of the more positive messaging that it's had.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks for ending on that optimistic note. At the end of the day, we need all parties to be embracing, as I'm sure you're aware, from the Conservative Environment Network, to be embracing this issue, because at the end of the day, governments change, as we've seen, and they will change again. From a net zero and sustainability perspective, I wish you all the best in your endeavours over the coming months and years. And thanks very much indeed, Sam, for taking part in this chat with me this morning. And thanks for everyone for watching and listening. And thanks to our sponsors for Net Zero Week, Beyondly, Hitachi Zero Carbon, Manpower, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and Ramboll. Join us again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when we'll kick things off with a session on shaping the future of carbon capture. For now, thanks again to Sam and thanks to everybody else. And we'll see you tomorrow for the continuation of Net Zero Week. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andy.